The U.S. government is set to execute the only woman on federal death row later this month. Lisa Montgomery was convicted in 2004 of strangling a pregnant woman and kidnapping the baby by cutting it out of her body. Her execution is set for January 12th. She will be the first woman to be executed by the federal government since 1953. Federal executions have become commonplace under the Trump administration. 10 people have been put to death since July, with 3 more executions scheduled before President-elect Joe Biden is sworn in. A recent article published by ProPublica reports that in the Trump administration's rush to carry out these executions, it, quote, trampled over an array of barriers, both legal and practical. For more on this, I'm joined now by the author of that piece, Isaac Arnsdorf. Isaac, 2003 was the last year that the Justice Department carried out any federal executions. Why were they halted in the first place, and then why did the Trump administration bring them back?
Well, the reason for that hiatus was really practical as much as political or legal or anything else. So what happened was the drug that the federal government used in lethal injections became unavailable because under public pressure, the manufacturer stopped making it because they didn't want it to be used in executions anymore. So that created a problem for the federal government. They needed to find a new drug that could withstand court challenges that they could use to resume executions. And the shortage of this drug actually led the Obama administration to cancel its plans to conduct an execution in 2011. And so this was a problem that went on for a really long time. And when Trump was elected and Jeff Sessions was his first attorney general, he decided to make this a priority back in 2017 to figure out a new drug and secure a supplier for it that the government could use to start executing federal prisoners again. And it took a number of years to put that plan into motion so that they were ready to start in 2019.
Well, William Barr is obviously no longer the Attorney General, but in your reporting, you say that his role in these executions was instrumental. Talk to us a little bit more about his part in this.
That's right. So by the time that Barr became Attorney General, this was kind of teed up for him because of the work that had begun earlier in the Trump administration. But Barr was really instrumental in getting it to completion. So he was the one who authorized this new drug to be used in these lethal injections, and that he scheduled the first wave of executions. So they originally planned to start with 5 executions, and they were going to put 3 in 1 week, which, so, think about, you haven't done any executions in 17 years, and you decide to do the first 3 all within a few days of each other. And the Bureau of Prisons, which oversees the executions and the federal prison system, was concerned about this idea because there was an execution in Oklahoma using the same drug, actually, that went really gruesomely awry. And one of the reasons that the state found that contributed to this was that the staff was basically more stressed out because there were 2 executions scheduled that day. So there was a known concern about booking multiple executions within a short amount of time. But according to the Bureau of Prisons, the reason they did it that way is because Barr, the Attorney General, wanted it that way. So he was really the key person in continuing this priority that started with Jeff Sessions, but to really get it over the finish line, so to speak, and to not just do it a few times, but to do it more times than has been done since World War II.
Well, 3 more people, as you mentioned, are set to be executed before President Trump leaves office. What more can you tell us about their cases?
So this is significant, obviously, since it's continuing after the election, and significantly the election of a president who opposes the death penalty and would not be likely to continue with these executions during his presidency. But the executions are continuing during this lame duck period, this transition period. So that, again, we're having, in the week after next, there are 3 executions scheduled just within that 1 week, a few days apart. The first one is Lisa Montgomery, who you mentioned, who would be the first woman executed by the federal government since the 50s. She's currently the only woman on death row. Now, that date is currently in litigation because it was scheduled while a judge had a stay So in other words, a judge said, you can't execute this person until we have more litigation about it. And the government went ahead and scheduled it anyway. And so the judge said, well, that date's not valid. Then an appeals court just reversed that. So there could be additional appeals. It could go to the Supreme Court. So we have to see if that date actually ends up happening as it's scheduled on January 12th. And then a few days after that, later that week, there are 2 more men scheduled to be executed. And the wrinkle in their cases is that they've both tested positive for COVID-19. And there's some, because there were a number of positive cases at the death row facility after an execution in November, there's a lot of concern that these executions have become super spreading events. And kind of there's an operational question of, how could you go through with these executions without exposing a lot more people to infection?
Well, Isaac, it wasn't the Trump administration that delivered these death sentences. And as you mentioned, they were stopped because of a problem procuring the drug. So what role does the Trump administration really have in deciding which prisoners are, in fact, executed?
Well, the Trump administration made it a priority that they wanted to impose these death sentences. And then Barr, as Attorney General, along with a number of aides, including Jeffrey Rosen, who has now succeeded him as the acting Attorney General, made the actual decisions of who they were going to execute. And the government really hasn't given a straight answer about how they made that decision. Specifically, the first 5 people who they announced, they said the government's explanation was that they had all murdered children or the elderly. But in fact, that wasn't true. In one of the cases, that prisoner, who was actually the first to be executed, the undisputed evidence in the case was that he did not murder the child of the family. And actually, his co-defendant was the one who murdered the child, but his co-defendant was sentenced to life, not to death. So that explanation from the government wasn't true. And similarly, they said, well, we're executing these 5 people because they murdered children and the elderly, but there were a number of other death row inmates who had also murdered children and the elderly, whose executions weren't scheduled. So this kind of illustrates the point that a lot of opponents of the death penalty make, that it's kind of arbitrarily imposed, and that's an argument that they make for why it can't be just when it's imposed so arbitrarily.
And in your reporting, Isaac, you found that the Trump administration paid private executioners in cash and bought drugs from secret companies to carry out these executions. Talk to us a little bit more about the implications of these actions and why officials resorted to these tactics.
Well, the reason for using private contractors to actually conduct the executions, we don't have an answer to. That's another one of these instances where the government has just not given the public an explanation for why it made the decisions that it did. As for the secrecy, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the old drug that became unavailable because of the public pressure. And so the government really wants to guard the identities of its suppliers because it knows that if they were to become public, that public exposure would lead to public pressure that could cause them to back out, and the government wouldn't be able to go through with this anymore.
So, Isaac, in a few weeks, President-elect Joe Biden is going to be sworn in as our next president. Has he taken a position on any of these executions? Is he under pressure from parts of his party to stop these executions, potentially even abolish the death penalty, which has been something that Democrats have debated internally amongst their own ranks for years?
The president-elect has said that he opposes the death penalty and wants to work to eliminate it. Now, his staff has indicated that that's more likely through legislation than unilateral executive action, but he is coming under pressure from Democratic lawmakers now because of these executions by the Trump administration to take some action. For example, he could commute the remaining death row sentences, commute them to life in prison. He could also tell the Justice Department no longer to authorize prosecutors to seek the death penalty in future cases. So there are things that he could do. He hasn't said specifically, he hasn't commented on these individual executions, that have happened or remain to happen during the transition. But absolutely, there is a rising course within his party and within the roughly half of the country that opposes the death penalty, putting pressure on him to act on what he said is his belief of opposition.
All right, Isaac Arnsdorf, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.